Hello, my name is Marisol Randall, President-elect and State Advocacy Chair of Texas PTA. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar called Preparing to Advocate During the Next Legislative Session. We will be sharing some tips to help you plan for strong meetings with your legislators and legislative staffers. In only 56 days, the Texas legislature will convene for its regular 140-day session and start making decisions that will impact the health, the safety, and future of our students. PTA must be a thunderous voice this session. Today's webinar will cover what your PTA can start doing now within your own community to advocate for Texas children and youth, including a quick lesson on using Zoom, the virtual meeting platform. Now, I'll hand it off to Ellen Arnold and Taylor Acock, Texas PTA's governmental affair consultants, to give us a preview of the coming session and some great tips for advocating during a pandemic. Ellen?
Thank you, Marisol. It's a pleasure to be here today and to see so many familiar faces. I know you're ready to advocate for Texas kids, but before we can talk about advocating, we need to know the environment in which we will be advocating. So let's take a few minutes to talk about that. Couple of comments, and I'll be really short with or really quick with these comments today because I'm guessing that many of you were on last week's webinar about the Texas PTA priorities. The interim period between legislative sessions is about 15 to 17 months, and we're in that period of time right now. The main thing to know about that is that pre-filing of legislation began last week. So legislators who worked throughout the interim to identify bills they wanted to pass or pursue this session and had them drafted by legislative council were able to begin to file those bills last week. And the significance of that is that they will get a smaller bill number, which means their bills will get referred to committees sooner and they'll be in the queue quicker for hearings. Theoretically, during a pandemic, things are always a little bit different, but that's what is supposed to happen. Regarding the political landscape, the Texas House did not change. There are going to be 83 Republicans and 67 Democrats again this session. Some of the faces have changed, but the numbers have not. The speaker's race has been decided. You'll remember that in the Texas House, the speaker is not selected statewide the way that the lieutenant governor is in the Senate, who leads the Senate, but instead the members of the House elect the speaker. And the day after the election, Representative Dade Phelan, a Republican from Beaumont, announced that he had sufficient pledges for his candidacy to become the next Speaker of the Texas House. After a few days of back and forth negotiating with other candidates for that same position of Speaker, Representative Phelan did prevail, and he is now the presumptive Speaker of the Texas House. In the Senate, Republicans lost one seat, and it's one located in the San Antonio region of the state. So this coming session, the Senate will have 18 Republicans and 13 Democrats. Because of COVID, as I've said many times, we do not expect very many pieces of legislation to pass this session, although it is interesting to note that when pre-filing began last week, as of Friday, so 5 days into pre-filing of legislation, the Texas legislature broke a record for the number of bills that had been pre-filed. So we're all anxious to see how that plays out. You all know that Texas recently passed a milestone related to COVID-19, and that is that we achieved the milestone and have now passed it of 1 million cumulative cases in the state since the start of the pandemic. We also have the unhappy distinction of being 10th in the country, in the world, I'm sorry, in terms of the number of total cases that we've had in Texas. If we were a country, we would place, again, 10th in the world alongside Italy for the number of cases that we have had since the beginning of COVID-19. As a result, we believe that advocacy will be very different this session. Presumptive Speaker Dade Phelan who established a bipartisan work group to review and make recommendations on the legislative operations during COVID. We're really anxious to hear what recommendations they'll make. The gossip is that they will, that the legislature will not allow many people from the public to come into the building. So it's going to be really interesting to see how they adapt in order to allow for public input into the process. Phelan has suggested that on January 12th, when the legislature convenes, that his plan is for the members of the Texas House to be sworn in, for him to be elected Speaker, for the House to adopt rules, which are always very important at every session. But this session, they'll be especially important because the rules that will be adopted will take into account how the legislature is going to operate. Are they going to allow virtual hearings in the House the way that the Senate is doing during the interim? Are they going to allow people into the building? How many people? Will they allow virtual testimony during the session? And how will they take votes? Will they be able to operate if they're shut down due to exposure? Will they be allowed to operate virtually and actually vote on pieces of legislation? So that's going to be a really important debate. And then Phelan has stated that after that, he plans to adjourn for 30 days, send all the Texas House members back to their districts, and wait until February before he calls anyone back into Austin for session. Of course, that does not take into account what they would do if the governor were to announce an emergency item, which would call them all back. Because emergency items announced by the governor have to be dealt with immediately. So we'll wait and see what happens there. As far as the economy goes, the only couple of things that I want to mention is that Texas went from a $2.8 billion surplus prior to COVID, or projected surplus prior to COVID, to a $4.6 billion deficit in the current budget, the budget that we are operating in right now. We are $4.6 billion in the hole. So the first thing that will have to happen when the legislature comes back is they'll have to pass a supplemental budget to fund the final costs and expenses of this current budget that we're operating in right now. The governor did require all state agencies to cut their current budgets by 5%. And when they submitted their legislative appropriations request for the coming budget, the next 2-year budget, they were required to maintain a 5% cut. So let's talk about some good news. There is a little bit of good news. Our Economic Stabilization Fund, or Rainy Day Fund, has a balance, and it's projected to have a balance at the beginning of the session in January of close to $9 billion. So we're very happy about that. E-commerce is doing quite well in the state. A lot of us are buying using our computers, a lot of us are buying online. And the sales taxes collected by online marketplace providers in particular are way up, and that's going to be helpful. Another piece of good news is that we fully expect a second federal stimulus package to be passed, and that is going to provide much needed federal dollars to help us survive this budget writing process. Also, the CARES Act, the remaining CARES Act dollars that the governor has been holding on to from that first tranche of CARES Act relief, roughly $5 to $6 billion, has to be spent before December. And we believe, and in fact, we were informed a few days ago that I believe it was $420 million are going to be utilized to reimburse Texas schools for expenses related to COVID that they incurred early in the COVID crisis. So roughly 420 million will be spent on that. So that's really good news. My favorite good news is young voters. Texas young voters aged 18 to 29 led the nation in early voting this month. And over 1.2 million young Texans cast early ballots compared to 19 million over the entire 2016 election. So according to Tufts University, the top 3 issues that are driving young voters to the polls are coronavirus, racism, and climate change. We're happy to see that our young voters are engaged in voting. And lastly, we've all learned how, and this is good news, we've all learned how to operate virtually this last 8 or 10 months. We know how to do this. Had we been surprised in January with something like this, I don't think we would have been able to effectively advocate, but we know how to do things virtually now, and we will be able to make our voices heard this next session. So what's possible next session? We'll pass a budget no matter what. It's the only thing we have to do constitutionally. We think we have a good chance to protect funding for public schools. There is strong support among legislators for that. It's going to be really critical, though, that we get some CARES Act funding to help us offset those costs and the anticipated shortfall of much more than $4 billion for the coming budget. We also believe that we've got a really good shot at passing legislation to create a long-term plan for addressing the digital divide in Texas, and we're hoping that we'll be able to get some funding as well. There will be an effort, some of you may remember this from last session, but there will be an effort to pass a bill that limits the use of taxpayer dollars by cities, counties, and school districts to hire lobbyists to advocate for them during the legislative session. We know that several of those bills have already been filed, so we'll be working to make sure that they carve Texas PT out of that legislation this time. So moving on, let's talk about how to advocate during a pandemic. Whether it's during a pandemic or whether you plan to be at the Capitol face-to-face 1 or 10 times during the session, the first thing that has to happen is you need to make sure you know after an election who your legislator is, who your legislators are. And so I just wanted to take you quickly through this process of figuring out who your legislator is. You scroll down, you click on the link that I showed you a moment ago, you scroll down to finding your officials, you enter your zip code. You enter your street address. And you find out who your legislators are. Here are the federal legislators, and then you get to your state officials. And if you scroll down to right here, in my case, my state senator is Sarah Eckhart, and she's new. Kirk Watson resigned, and she replaced him in a special election. So that's one reason that it's always important to double check, because the elections change things, and you don't want to assume, you want to be sure you know who's representing you now. But I want to just show you quickly what you'll find out when you go through this process. You will get your legislators' contact information. You'll get some background on your legislator. You'll find out when they were first elected and what their political affiliation is. All of these are important things to know before you meet with your legislators. And we would encourage you to go beyond that to take a look at media around your legislators, look at their campaign website, find out what they're interested in, because that's going to give you a clue to the kind of legislation that they may file. So now we will attempt to move on to the next slide.
While Ellen's getting that set up, I'll start running through what the slide will say when it's back up there. As it is for most things, it's good to be prepared for a meeting with legislators or with their staff members. After figuring out who your legislator is, we suggest taking a few minutes to research them. Remember that while they may be legislators, they're also members of your community. So there could be quite a few commonalities between y'all. Your hometown, the college you attended, maybe a sorority or a fraternity affiliation, hobbies, a church affiliation, or even your children may go to the same school. There we go. So we suggest reviewing their bios and making sure that you know just a little bit about them. Ellen, if you'll go back to the previous slide.
Yes, I will. And thank you for your patience, everybody. We're learning a new system here.
Thank you, Ellen. So number 2 on that list in preparing for meetings is sending a copy of the PTA priorities to the legislators' schedulers in advance. It's very common for staff to brief their bosses on the content of the meeting beforehand. It's not just important for staff and members to have the priorities, but it's just as important for you and your group to review the priorities beforehand as well. We suggest reviewing the webinars on the policy issues, and additionally, going over to the Texas PTA website, which has more background information on each PTA priority. And last, you may have seen an email from Amy or from the leadership over at PTA earlier today, but the new Texas PTA Zoom background has been released. If you head over to the website, you'll find it there. If you feel comfortable adding it to your Zoom platform, we ask that you use it as your background during your meetings. It's just another reminder of who you are, who you represent, and why you're there. Next slide, Ellen. So we encourage you to Zoom with your legislators before the legislative session begins in January. Right now, during this interim time period, legislators are much more available, more relaxed, more willing to take the time to discuss issues. A Zoom call in December or early January is a perfect time for this. We suggest a short Zoom to introduce yourself, describe your role in your local PTA, and that you plan to be active this session on all policies affecting Texas children and youth. Say you'll be in touch to set up a Zoom with your colleagues, leaders in PTA in February to share Texas PTA's top priorities. After that, follow up with an email to share the priorities document so that they'll have it on hand and are ready when you come back during session. This is also a really good tactic to setting up a Zoom during session. As your legislators, schedulers will know your name, that you're a constituent, that you represent the Texas PTA, and they'll be much more likely to meet with you a second time if you're a group that they have met before. And then in February, make a request for your Zoom meeting. If you're having multiple Zoom meetings, make sure you allow for a little bit of time between. We've got several legislators who can be very chatty Cathys, so many times they will run over. Next slide, Ellen. So when you're preparing your agenda for meetings with legislators and senior staffers, in addition to presenting the Texas PTA priorities, there's often an interest to share local concerns. The guide on the screen is designed to help you determine whether the issue of concern in your community is one that the state legislature can address. For example, items that only affect your children are not items that the legislature can address through policy. Items that deal with roads or school crossings are also not dealt with by the Texas legislature. Items that affect all or most students in the state are items that may be dealt with by the Texas legislature. If you're going to mention a local concern, be sure it's one that the legislature has authority on. The next few slides will walk us through the steps to a great meeting with your legislator or his or her staff person.
Okay, so a few little suggestions for you to ensure that you have a successful meeting. You're going to want to confirm your Zoom meetings a day or two before your appointment. You'll want to provide an attendee list and confirm that constituents of the legislator will be attending the Zoom. That is a really important and key piece of information that all legislators like to know. We recommend that the host of the Zoom, and keep in mind that there's nothing keeping an individual person from doing everything we're talking about in this presentation. Generally, the complicating factors are when you're having a group participate. So we're focusing on how to do this as a group or with a group. But if you're an individual who wants to participate in Virtual Rally Day this year, all of these steps apply to you, or most of them do. So we're recommending that the host log on to Zoom roughly 10 minutes early, just to make sure that if the legislator gets on early, there's someone there to let them in and greet them. Also, if you're planning to do any kind of screen sharing or presentation, you want to sort of get yourself ready for that. You should be ready for anything. The legislator might be late. He or she might have to pass the meeting off to a senior staffer. At the last minute, they may come in really jazzed about something that they've been debating or discussing in a hearing, and may want to talk about that the whole time, and you may have to sort of use your skills to get them back on track. But at any rate, be ready for anything. Be sure that your phones are turned off so that you don't have disruptions during your Zoom, and expect these meetings to last somewhere around 15 to 25 minutes. A little bit shorter during the legislative session. Be sure that you work from some sort of an agenda that you've developed in advance. And we recommend this just as a suggestion. But one way to organize yourself, if you are a group, is to assign a few roles. Not everyone in your group has to have a role, but it helps if you have one person, and it's often the host, who handles the introductions, some opening remarks, some closing statements, and keeps an eye on the amount of time that is remaining if you estimate that you'll have 20 or so minutes to speak. And then you might identify 2 or 3 people, depending upon the size of your group, to share the priorities. Now, it's pretty tough to get through all of Texas PTA's priorities in a meeting of this length. So what you might want to do, you know, or you will know soon, that the PTA has 5 top priorities this session that have to do with funding, maintaining the funding for public schools, extending, addressing the digital divide, and 3 others. And so you may want to focus just on those. But as Taylor said earlier, you will have sent the entire list of priorities to the legislator in advance. And so there may be an opportunity for or maybe interest on the part of the legislator to ask questions about some of the other priorities. It's possible also that there may be one priority in particular that your group is very interested in, and you may decide that you want to focus on that one in addition to the top 5 priorities. Then lastly, if there is a person in your group who has a personal story that is appropriate for one of the priorities, you might consider letting the person share that story. Now, this is a risky, I hesitate when I say it because this is a risky thing to do. Sometimes personal stories take longer than you expect them to take, and can absorb all of the time that, or a lot of the time that's available for your meeting. So keep that in mind when you decide, but there may be someone whose story is so compelling that you decide to do that. And then your host will close the meeting. So a couple of tips for maximum impact. Be prepared to meet with a staffer. It happens a lot. Hopefully, and most of the time it doesn't happen that you're asked to meet with an intern. Usually, particularly for PTA members and groups, you would be, if you weren't able to meet with the legislator, you would be slotted to an education staffer or a senior staffer. But don't show that you're upset. Don't let it impact the way that you make your presentation. Staffers in the legislature are very important. They often are the content experts. So be sure that you make a very strong presentation, even if it's to a staffer. And then if that has happened to you, after the meeting, follow up with the scheduler and ask for another meeting when they're back in the district, or either in person or by Zoom, just to touch base on a couple of the issues that you wanted to cover during your presentation. Stick to your plan or your agenda. If you are meeting with someone who disagrees with a particular priority of Texas PTA, be sure that you remain cordial and respectful. And it's very possible that at some point you may have to politely agree to disagree, but stay calm and stay respectful. Don't argue. A few more tips. Please don't answer a question if you don't know the answer. There's no shame in not knowing the answer. Tell the legislator or the staff person that you don't know, but you will find out. Reach out to Texas PTA. We'll get the answer for you and help you to get it back to that legislator in that legislative office. If you can, take a screenshot of the legislator during this Zoom call, post it on social media, your PTA social media at the local level, and send it to Texas PTA as well, so that we can put things up on the Texas PTA Facebook page. Please follow up with a thank you note. It can be sent by email. This is 2020, will be 2021, and folks have certainly gotten out of the habit of writing a personal thank you note. But I will tell you that legislators still write paper thank you notes when you send a contribution. So I know that if they can do it, we can probably do it as well. But either way, the important thing is to thank your legislator for his or her time. Mention any staff that you met with by name. Legislators are like any other employer. They like to hear that their employees represent them well. And so it makes them feel good to know that you had a good experience and were respectfully treated by their staff. And then provide meeting feedback if there's anything particularly relevant to Texas PTA through our president-elect or her designee, Marisol Randall. The kind of feedback that we're talking about in this case would be if a legislator said to you as you were laying out the priorities, I'm going to sign on to that bill, or I support that legislation, or I oppose that legislation and I'm going to fight to defeat it. Those kinds of things are the sorts of intelligence, if you will, that we would really appreciate having. Now, I like to share this particular slide, and I'm not going to go over all of it because I think a lot of people think that advocacy takes a really long time, is very involved, requires a major commitment, when in reality, there are lots of things that busy moms and dads can do to advocate. You can leave a phone message for a legislator about a bill once the session starts. I often suggest to advocates that are really busy, when you know that you need to leave a call, leave a message, or when you know that you need to weigh in about a piece of legislation with a legislator, call them after hours. Their phones will go to voicemail and you'll be able to leave your message and it will be picked up by staff the following day, and you'll be on the record as a constituent who has weighed in about a bill that Texas PTA has asked you to weigh in on. Another way to advocate that doesn't take any time at all is to forward Under the Dome to someone who doesn't subscribe to it. Maybe it's a neighbor of yours, another member in PTA, or maybe it's the legislator, and there's something relevant in that particular Under the Dome that you'd like to share with him or her. Jumping down to look at what you can do in 10 minutes, you can send an email to all the members of the legislature, all the members of a relevant legislative committee with a position on a particular bill that they're going to hear. 30 minutes, you can meet with a legislator when they're back in your district to talk about bills that are moving through the Texas legislature. So these are just examples, but they're designed to remind you that you can be an advocate even if you're very busy, like most of us are. Now, there are 3 different URLs that I have listed here, and I bring them up and I mention to them, and you might want to take a screenshot of them, because these are various pages on Texas PTA's website where you can find more information about things that will help you be a better advocate. I'm not going to click on them because I learned a few moments ago that when I do that, it will be very hard to get back to this presentation. But you will have access to this recorded webinar in a couple of days. It will be, I believe, posted on Texas PTA's website, and you'll be able to go back in and click on these. If you take a screenshot now, you'll be able to access them even more quickly by going to texaspta.org. Now Taylor is going to talk about, give you a little tutorial on how to use Zoom.
Thanks, Ellen. What we know is that advocating at the legislature is going to look a bit different this session. We know that it's highly unlikely that the Capitol will be open to the public, and therefore legislators and staff may continue to use video conferencing platforms, namely Zoom, to meet with constituents and advocates. Many of you may have questions about setting up your own Zoom call, so what we're going to do next is just walk through some of Zoom's basic features. First, if you don't already have Zoom downloaded, we suggest that you download the free version. Please note that the free version only allows for 40-minute meetings. It's unlikely that legislators during session will schedule an hour-long meeting, but just in case, make sure you remember your time limit when you're setting up these meetings. Once downloaded, you'll be asked to sign in. It'll look like this page. Next slide. Once logged in, really familiarize yourself with this home screen, both those 4 big buttons as well as the bar across the top. This is going to be essentially where you mainly operate from. You'll see in the bottom left corner is the schedule button. You will be using that function to set up a meeting with your legislator. Once you hit that schedule button, you're going to be taken to a screen that looks like this. This essentially allows for you to make decisions about the meeting time, when you're going to set it on the calendar, make sure that you're putting in AM, PM, Central Time, all of those really basic items. It allows for you to set a passcode or create a waiting room. Allows for you to turn your video on beforehand so that when you log in, your video is already ready. And so you'll be given a litany of options to select when setting up your Zoom meeting. Next slide. Upon saving what would have been the previous slide, once you hit save, a screen that may look like this will populate. This is what my Outlook email looks like. It may look different for your Gmail or whatever email platform that you use. No matter, usually every email platform has a invite function. So share this invite with the folks who'll be joining you, and don't forget to put the office scheduler on there as well. Next slide. Up one back, I think. Yeah. In order to begin a meeting the day of, you as the host will open up Zoom to this screen, which is found under the Meetings tab up top. When you're ready to begin the meeting, you'll hit the start button and you will be allowed in. And on this slide, what we've got here is the traditional Zoom screen, one that you're likely looking at now, a Zoom within a Zoom, I guess. But in the bottom left corner, you're going to see the mute button. If you aren't speaking, it's really good practice to put yourself on mute. For instance, if you've got yard guys outside like I do now, this can be super helpful, just to make sure that there's no background noise during the meeting. Good thing to remember is be sure to unmute yourself when you want to talk. I know we all forget that from time to time. Next along that bottom bar is the stop video function. While you do have the ability to stop your video, it is good practice, especially if you're meeting with a legislator or staff, to have your video on during the meeting if at all possible. Next is the Participants tab. It's under this function that you'll be able to look at who's in the Zoom or who may be in the waiting room that you need to let in. Next is this green button. It's the share screen button, and it's the one that gives, I think, all of us the most trouble. If you are hosting a meeting, we really urge you to do a practice run if you're going to be sharing your screen, sharing a document throughout the meeting, and make sure that you really familiarize yourself with that. And last on that tab is a record button. We don't suggest recording your legislative meeting. I know it could be tempting to have it in your archives for a personal memory, but we don't suggest recording simply because we don't want to make legislators or staff feel uncomfortable. We want them to feel like they can talk openly and candidly with their constituents. The last thing I'll say is that if you are having trouble with Zoom or have any questions, there is a whole Zoom help website dedicated to walking folks through Zoom step by step. So if you just go to the Zoom website, it's got all the materials you could ever need.
Thank you, Taylor. Couple more comments and questions, and just a few sort of reminders for you as you begin to prepare for Rally Day 2021. First thing I want to be sure to say again is that Rally Day, Virtual Rally Day 2021, will take place on February 22nd. So here's some suggestions and some questions for you. Have you shared the priorities flyer, Texas PTA priorities flyer, and the webinar that reviews the priorities with other PTA members? Have you put the date, February 22nd, Virtual Rally Day, on your PTA, school, and district calendars? Have you been talking about Rally Day and including information in every communication with PTA members? Does your principal know? Have you asked for support from your principal and perhaps even your superintendent? Have you started recruiting people to participate in this session's virtual rally day? One other reminder, if I back up one bullet, is to ask or remind you that if your principal has an e-newsletter, and most of them do, ask permission to put information about virtual rally day in each of the newsletters that come out between now and then. Uh-oh. Seem to have had a computer glitch. It's frozen on this slide. There we go. A few Rally Day resources to mention. Under the Dome is generally your source for all things advocacy. The Voice electronic magazine, Texas PTA's electronic magazine, is another very good source of information. Be sure that you're signed up for both of those. Be sure you've liked Texas PTA's Facebook page, and as we mentioned earlier, explore the advocacy page on Texas PTA's website. And then share this webinar with your group. Oh boy. Today is requiring a good bit of patience from our participants. At any rate, this time next session, we will be preparing to bring probably 3,000 members to Austin to rally in 2023. But in the meantime, let's be sure that we're a thunderous virtual voice for Texas children when the session begins on January 12th in 2021.
Thank you, Ellen and Taylor. I do have 3 questions that, since we have a little bit of time, can we answer them?
Sure.
One question is, in public testimony, is public testimony required for a bill to be passed?
Wow, that's a really good question. And one that we have been discussing and trying to get the answer to. You know, one would assume that it should be required, public input should be required, but it's not entirely, I'm not entirely certain that it is required statutorily. And if it is, it's possible that the testimony may need to be submitted in writing rather than in person or by video testimony. So that is one of the rules that are going to have to be determined or adopted during that rules debate on the first day of the legislative session.
Right, thank you, Ellen.
Mhm.
Is there anything possible we can do to ensure any additional CARES Act money that comes to Texas is in addition to funding Texas is providing rather than be used to offset money that Texas has budgeted?
That's another really good question. I'm just writing myself a note about the previous question because we need to finish that research, and then we'll put an email out or put something in Under the Dome when we get an answer to that previous question. I have heard this question asked quite a bit, and there's a little bit of nuance to our situation in Texas that I think is really important to understand. When we talked about finance and what our financial situation, our economic situation is in Texas right now, I mentioned that in our current budget, we're $4.6 billion in the hole. We would have been probably, well, we would have no doubt been much further in the hole had the state not used some of that first tranche of CARES Act dollars to backfill and to pay mainly schools for operating. And so I guess my point is that we've got a couple of options. If we end up being $8 or $9 or $10 billion in the hole going into this coming session, and have to write a 2-year budget with a deficit of that size, the options are going to be very, very limited. We can either spend that money to fill that deficit, which would include preserving, hopefully, all of the funding that should be coming to public schools that was authorized by House Bill 3, and hopefully covering other of the state's obligations, such as Health and Human Services funding for people all across the state. So I think the thing to remember is that we anticipate a large deficit going into the coming session. We will get an estimate of how big that deficit is from Comptroller Hager at the just prior to the start of the session. And that will tell us, what we've got to work with. But if that deficit is large, I talked about where we could get money. We've got almost a $9 billion surplus in our economic stabilization fund, but we can't spend all of that. We have to leave a certain amount in that fund. And then the CARES Act dollars should, at least a portion of them, will probably need to go to backfilling that deficit in the amount of available revenue that the state is projected to have for the next 2 years.
Thank you. Last two, can you discuss here or at another webinar how funding gets approved and how it gets distributed, or where can we learn about it?
Wow, that is a really complex question. Good job. I don't think we have time to discuss how, Marisol, it was how funding is approved and how it's distributed.
Can you discuss here or at another webinar how funding gets approved and how it gets distributed?
Well, I can probably answer part of that the first part of that question pretty quickly. Each of the chambers of the Texas legislature, the Senate and the House, have a budget writing committee. In the Senate, it's called the Finance Committee, and in the House, it's called the Appropriations Committee. These committees generally begin working during the interim, early in the interim period, to think about and begin to draft a bill that will fund the state for the next 2 years. The governor asks each agency to submit their requests for funding for the coming 2 years. And those requests are submitted during the summer, usually around August. And those requests are reviewed and utilized in part to draft this budget that will end up being the budget for, or the sort of the plan for the next 2 years. You'll remember that I said that the governor directed each agency to cut this budget's this session or this biennium's budget by 5%, and they directed each agency to carry that cut forward into the next legislative session when the writing of the new budget happens. And so these two committees each file a budget bill, and then they spend the rest of the session debating those bills, hearing them on the floor in committee, then hearing them on the floor of each chamber. Then they come and they hear each other's bills. The Senate will hear the House's budget bill. The House will hear the Senate's budget bill. And then they will go to what's called a conference committee made up of 5 senators and 5 House members. And that group will resolve all the differences between the 2 bills. They'll come back and each chamber has to approve that compromise budget bill. And that's in a nutshell how the budget gets written. How it gets distributed is another question. We'll have to do that on a different webinar, but thank you for that question.
And then the last one is my senator is the chair of the chair of the education committee. Any tips for VIPs?
Well, you are a lucky woman. He is Senator Taylor, Larry Taylor is a gentleman, and he is a very, what I would call mission-driven legislator. He's not one of those that are climbing the rungs of power or are doing this as a way to put something on a resume or a job application. He genuinely is, has found his passion as the chairman of Senate Education. He's pretty easy to talk to. He feels very strongly about what he feels strongly about, and he'll debate with you on issues with which you disagree, including things like our Texas PTA's opposition to vouchers, but he'll always do it in a respectful way. When you ask the question about tips for dealing with a VIP, I guess what I would say is he'll probably be the easiest VIP you have to deal with during the Texas legislative session. But if there are more, if you want to expand on that question, please do, and I'll be happy to try to answer something more specific.
All right. Thank you, Ellen, and thank you, Taylor, for talking with us today. Thank you all for attending today's webinar. Check out our website, www.txpta.org, in a day or two for a recording of today's webinar that you can share with your PTA to prepare for Rally Day Imagined, February the 22nd. Please note my contact information in the event if you have any questions at all. Be watching for more information about Rally Day. PTA, again, must be a thunderous voice this session. Thank you again for attending this webinar.